Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different media, books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, or mechanics is out, unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, psychopomp, and also your host. And today I am joined once more bind that didn't come out right. Once more by my regular co-host John Kernan.
It's okay. Sometimes we are all bound together by one thing. Is it a metaphor? Maybe. Is it real? Definitely.
Yes, that's right. As my wonderful co-host has very cryptically pointed out, even though you've all read the title. Today we begin a new cycle. So you all get to breathe a sigh of relief as we move on from politics onto something a little more palatable and easy to deal with. Death.
Death.
Onwards.
Hooray for death. That doesn't feel right to say.
So, much like with the aforementioned politics, when we talk about death in fiction, there's sort of two different levels of storytelling. There is how stories handle deaths in universe, and then there are stories about death, which are two different things that, are obviously related for obvious reasons, but we are going to sort of be talking about them both in this cycle to one extent or another. Yeah, not much to add to that bit, to be honest. Just those are the things that the death is in storytelling.
Yeah, there's a lot to look at because there's so many complex intricacies to how death affects life and affects people, but at the same time, in some ways, death is deceptively simple because it's the end. It's the end for the person, but not for everybody involved in them.
Yeah, it is. We've said it before about a handful of things, but especially about death. It is one of the handful of truly universal experiences that every single person that has ever lived and that will ever live has some sort of relationship with. Because we are mortal. We live and we die, and so does everything we know and hold dear. Yay!
Hooray. At the very least, death stands as an eternal monument that will always be there, something for us to measure our lives against all the way from beginning to end. And unfortunately, it can always pop up in the middle in other ways too, because since everything's gonna die, that means no matter what you're gonna do, what you do, you're gonna encounter it and deal with it, unless you happen to die very young, which would mean you're probably not listening to this podcast and would also be just as tragic, but just for everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it is the undefeatable enemy. It is the one great constant. It's the one unavoidable truth. Everything that exists must come to an end. Even the universe is finite and will one day cease to exist in its current form. And weirdly, in a lot of ways, like before we even get into the storytelling aspect of it, I just feel like it's worth acknowledging. As much as the loss and the grief hurts, as much as some of us may fear that end because we don't know what comes next or simply don't want to stop existing, or maybe it's the process that bothers us. The fact that everything ends is one of the few things that gives meaning to what we do whilst we're here.
Yeah, if nothing else, death is always context. It's the same way you can't really fully appreciate good feelings without a concept of pain. Death is the context for life.
Yeah, like obviously everyone's personal experience will differ. There will be different things that we take personal, individual meaning in. But nothing feels special in isolation. It's having something to compare to contrast against, that makes what you have feel so important. Being alive wouldn't feel so important to us if our time wasn't finite.
Yeah, and because death is such a powerful shade of context and something everybody has to deal with, it becomes a very strong narrative tool and a writing element because all too often it's so easy to think of death, at least narratively, as a very simple thing of like, oh man, if character dies, they're not in the story anymore. And I, as audience, might be happy or sad about that. But also, what about the characters? How will different characters react? How is this going to shape the story going forward based on how important the person is? What if the entire tone changes even separately from the characters? Because for all we know, like how much of how the author feels about death is going to bleed into this. Sometimes authors decide they have to kill a character, but even though they made the decision, they're just as sad about it as anybody who was friends with the character.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend of ours after he read my book. Because early onto it, he was like, "Wow, I really like this character. They're my favorite." And I
Well,
said, "Me too." And then, like a couple days later, I just get a message back that says, "You monster."
you monster. Like,
But
listen,
that's
it's
the
what happened.
yeah, but that's the thing is what one of the things I really wanted to talk about in this cycle is the mechanics of death in the story, in universe, because it should feel like a major thing. Just as death is a big deal for us in reality, for all the reasons we have already pointed out. In universe, 9 times out of 10, death should feel just as major and important to those characters. Characters should have strong feelings about death and deaths if you want them to feel like people most of the time. Obviously, there's exceptions, there's always exceptions. But
But even the exceptions are going through the lens of death because it's so big that if for any reason you're making a character who is immortal, that should be just as big a deal as somebody dying, sometimes a bigger deal. Like, do they even have a concept of death? Are they somebody who fought to get immortality through some sort of Faustian bargain? Are they some weird timeless being? Are they a god? Do they watch over mortals? Do they hate us? Could they not care less?
yeah, that's the thing. Even an immortal entity, if they are surrounded by mortals or overlooking mortals, is going to have feelings about death, about the finite nature of mortality, of worlds.
I love
Whether
Freyrin.
whether that's because they are confused by it. They don't understand it because of, like you said, because they fought to escape that, or because they long for it and are jealous of it. It's still deeply important, and for mortal characters themselves, I would say even more so because it's such a powerful part of our lives. Whether that is as a source of fear, as a source of grief, whether it's a motivator knowing you have limited time to get your goals reached. You know, characters when they experience death around them, they should be angry or sad or confused. They should grieve. If characters don't have a strong enough reaction to death of characters they should feel this about, especially, it takes you out the story and it hurts the tone of the narrative. As much as I love Star Wars, I cannot stress enough how much it irks me that Luke moves on from the people who raised him in about 30 seconds, but has this
Crazy.
incredible, powerful grief over the old wizard who he's known for like a day.
Be like, yeah, I get it. You had a connection. It's very special. It's very cool. He taught you the Force in a way he kind of taught you to feel the entire universe. That's not nothing. But like, what about essentially your parents whose charred skeletons you saw in your burned out home?
Yeah, like he seemed a little bit put out, a little bit sad for about 30 minutes.
What couldn't we have gotten at least one variant of like you're not my father, you killed my father at Darth Vader or something like that?
Yeah, it's it's one of those things again, I love Star Wars, love the OT. I like that movie a lot. But it has always bothered me, been this really weird, almost plot hole that something that should have sat with that character throughout the rest of the story didn't seem to bother him that much at all compared to some guy he barely knew.
Yeah, and it's a weird thing that it's consistently absent from Star Wars enough that like I think you make a great point because it's easy to try and blame it on the galactic scale of Star Wars that it so often has. You're like, oh, it's so big. People are dying left and right. A million things are happening. Characters are coming in and out of the story. Who has time to cry about every death? But sometimes, even in some of the smaller scale stories, it's actually weirdly consistently less weight than you expect to death in Star Wars, at least until we get into some of the later stuff, and they wanted us to be really sad about Han Solo dying. But even then, the story almost kind of had a bit of an air of, well, his son is here now, and he was old, so what's up with that? Why'd you stab your dad? And then like, um, it's for the most part the only time it feels like death really makes a big impact is with the very small scale intimate stories. Like weirdly enough, despite how much of an adventure of the week a lot of it is, on the rare occasion that somebody dies in The Bad Batch, for instance, that's treated as a big deal. But that's because it's a very like small, close-knit, intricate cast that otherwise pretty much just has outsiders who pop in and out.
Yeah, a major character dies in the Bad Batch, and it is felt throughout the entire rest of the show. It even minor character deaths in the Clone Wars or in Rogue One feel like they have more weight than the death of the main character's parental figures who raised him for like 18 years.
Yeah, and as far as we can see, it did it pretty lovingly. We never really hear or see anything bad about them. Like the worst we ever see from them is a little bit of meanness and negativity in Kenobi, but that's all directed at Ben because they're like, God, you're nothing but trouble. Why leave us alone?
Yeah, what we see of them in Kenobi is that they cared about Luke's safety so much that they, as untrained civilians, fought a fucking force wielder.
Yeah.
And they did so with like violently and passionately and desperately enough that they bought him time. They bought Kenobi time to get there, even. Like they were clearly good people.
Yeah.
So it's funny. It it actually retroactively made me more annoyed about the way their deaths were treated in the OT.
Yeah, it's almost kind of funny because with their deaths treated with such little weight, it's a really weird example of almost, I want to say, like authorial in absence of authorial intent because their deaths are important, but for some reason, their deaths are framed in a way to make only the audience feel something about it and make the audience like upset or give the audience context of, oh, this is how mean and fucked up the Empire is, that they just did this to the house of some farmers. That's crazy. And it's weird that it's only trying to be concerned about how the audience feels about that and not their child, not the person whose home was destroyed.
It's funny. You can tell that we definitely are not the only people to have these thoughts. You know, because you look at going right back to all the stuff I enjoyed as a kid, apparently. You know, you look at Aragon, which was deeply inspired by Star Wars and the traditional hero's journey. And Paolini, when he wrote those books, For young people, mind you, so you can't give Star Wars a pass because it was for young people.
Nope, especially not since he was 15 when he started.
Yeah. He clearly went, okay, I'm going to do basically that exact same storyline, except the death of my main character's caregivers is going to be given the same weight as the old mentor figure, and is in fact going to be a driving motivator for him through the entirety of the rest of the story.
We are never gonna let go of that burned farm and that dead uncle.
He hates the fucking Razak so much through the rest of the story. And that's
And they
exactly
don't
the
get
thing.
redeemed or
Nope,
contextualized either.
they just suck.
The only tiny little bit of context we get is that they're endangered and that's why they're so loyal to their master so that we can go, good, die. You're terrible, you're awful, you're evil, you hate humanity, you literally stink, die.
And yeah, it's just so strange to think of like what is one of the most iconic stories ever told has this very strange flaw. This like it's obviously not a perfect story. No story really is. There's always something you can pick out if you want to, but it's just such a strange thing. And it's not Star Wars is not the only story to have this problem. There's many out there with a similar problem where character deaths that should mean something are kind of just brushed off in the grand scheme of things. You know, the MCU does not have a lot of deaths. Okay, it had a lot of deaths.
It doesn't have a
Thanos,
lot of important
but
character deaths.
but the ones it does have, it's weird that some of them are not given the amount of weight they are due. I look at Quicksilver's death in Ultron, and Wanda gets angry and b blows up more Ultron bots for a bit, and then it is never talked about again, even
Yeah.
though she's lost her fucking brother, who she went through hell with.
But instead, we're going to make an entire show about her being sad about her boyfriend.
Which, it's fine that they did that. It's just weird with Vision. It's just weird that they didn't do anything with Quicksilver.
Yeah, literally the only thing we got with Quicksilver was like what I think WandaVision has its moment where almost he like an alternate version of her is created by the big fantasy she makes, but like there's not that much weight put on it. It almost feels like he's just there because he's family and she's building a family, not because she misses him so much or anything.
And it's a similar thing in Infinity War when we have multiple character deaths in that movie, and both of them are very important, very core characters to the whole of the first four phases of the MCU. That, of course, being, I mean, look, I think we're past this point where spoilers for that are a big deal. We lose both Black Widow and Iron Man in that movie. One of them gets a massive send off, and one of them is basically forgotten, even though she was played such a crucial role to so many people. Now, it's not quite as like egregious as Luke's parents, I'll admit, but it is strange how little respect, I guess, her death is given compared to Iron Man's. In a vacuum, it wasn't terrible, but it was just strange.
Yeah, because one of the biggest parts of the Avengers is supposed to be this like this interwoven like web of relationships between all these characters. They should all be very important to each other and important to the plot. And Black Widow is also one of the two like truly fully human people in the Avengers. Tony doesn't count. That man is not fully human. His brain is alien. But like it feels weird because there's so many little things I can pull at right away, even just thinking of Black Widow for 5 seconds, like how she's supposed to be best friends with like Clint Hawkeye. They have like this really close special connection that nobody else in the Avengers has.
He was
The
the only one
movie,
that really seems to feel it as much as he should have.
yeah, and then the movie was doing these fun, interesting hints at the Hulk having a crush on her, which is easy for everybody to be like, "Oh man, the Hulk can have a crush on I would," but no. I don't mean Bruce Banner had a crush on her. I mean the Hulk. The Hulk personality had a crush on her, and that's really interesting and could go a lot of ways, especially because who would be more mad about the person they have a crush on dying than the Hulk, the avatar of anger?
One of the big side plots in Ultron was that Banner and Hulk together as an entity, I guess, and Black Widow had this whole like developing almost romance going on that didn't end up really happening because Banner freaked out and got in a spaceship and buggered off to Sakaar. But the point stands, it's weird that he didn't seem nearly bothered enough.
Yeah, would have made a lot more sense if her death was the reason he left, and then we touched on that when we found him.
But that sequence of events is way out of order. But yeah.
Yeah, it's way out of order and also never addressed. He doesn't. He's mad and sad and being a little baby about other shit. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I mean, this is not the only way that you could have that stories in universe can have weird relationships with character death, as a side note. And having mentioned the MCU, superhero stories and, similar stories are some of the biggest offenders to having weird in-universe relationships with death, or at least like from a writing standpoint, I should say more than in-universe here.
Yeah, comic books more than almost anything else have the constant hook of the status quo pulling on them and demanding they not move too far from the center.
Yeah, because it's weird. It's weird when characters don't react appropriately for who they are, for their relationships with characters to deaths. Because death should feel significant. The threat of death in and of itself is one of the highest stakes that can be presented to you as an audience. But there's other ways you can cheapen that for the audience as well as just having characters in universe having strange reactions to people they should deeply care about dying. Because
Yeah,
there's an unfortunate thing that people do where writers cheapen death themselves. I mean, obviously it's all the writers doing, but I mean mechanically they make the death not feel significant by doing fake outs or easy resurrections or things like that, where suddenly the risk of death, the threat of death, doesn't matter anymore. One of the most significant threats you can pose to someone ceases to matter because it's just undone and the status quo returned. And yeah, comic books in particular are really bad about this.
another reason that Under the Red Hood is great.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on that a little bit because you've sort of pointed at something that is worth noting. Because this issue doesn't mean you can't do fake outs or even resurrections. It's just that those things should still come with consequences that make the death itself or the almost death feel significant. Because even almost dying, let alone dying and coming back, is still traumatic because death is significant. It means something, or at least it should, both to the audience and to the people in universe.
A near-death experience. I mean, it's just that. It's everything that you are, everything that you want to do, everything that you ever would have done, being a hair's breadth away from coming to an end too early. Especially because, like, as humans, despite how random death can be, it's hard for us to think of it that way. A death, especially your own, even if you might be more sad about the thought of other people dying, your own death more than any other, if you're not ready for it, feels like the story ending before it's supposed to.
Yeah, because I mean that's it. Death is the end. It's the end of all potential for more. That's why writers have the issue of doing things like resurrections and fake outs so much. It's because they want the shock value and the emotional impact of the death. But then they go, oh, but this character's so liked and there's still so much I could do with them. Okay, I'll undo the death and I can have the best of both worlds, but then you end up cheapening both. And that's why the Red Hood is so good because it does a resurrection, but the death still matters. The death was painful and the resurrection was not much better. And those things changed Jason Todd. He came back a broken, different person.
And it's funny because they put so much weight on obviously the narrative part of it. Like, we learn partway through the story, like we said when we talked about it, that the thing he is ultimately the most upset about, even though he knows it was for a good reason, was that Batman's not doing more to avenge him, to give context that he doesn't seem more affected by his death. The fact that the man who did it is still living, breathing, and cackling like a
And
madman in
doing
the
it to other
corner.
people.
And and that's something that they work through, and it gets partially turned around, and that's why we get Jason Todd not being a villain. But Red Hood, other than in a couple stories where he does things like take on the mantle of Batman when nobody else can, never becomes more than an anti-hero because what he's gone through and also the act of coming back to life itself has broken at least a small part of him that will never fully come back. He can never be the same person he was. Not in a million years, not even close.
Exactly. Another really good resurrection. I don't know. Have you seen much of Buffy?
Only some. I definitely watched it a lot when I was a kid, but most of my watching of it was young enough that I think I was taking in very little of my life experiences back then.
Yeah, it's a really interesting example for the purpose of talking about resurrections because it has an early one where Buffy dies, goes to hell, comes back, and it really does not seem to be made nearly big enough a deal of. But in a much later season, in the finale, she sacrifices herself to foil the plans of this crazy god lady and protect her sister because she has one at that point. It's a whole thing. It's complicated, but it's in the next season they resurrect her again, and they do it very differently this time. They miss her. The people who are still alive, they miss her. They feel her absence, and they go through a ritual to bring her back. And she doesn't seem quite right. She seems depressed after being resurrected and not quite with it, even a little bit angrier, maybe. It has been a bit since I've seen it. And it comes out in all places the musical episode, weirdly enough, but it comes
Great.
out that they brought her back from heaven, not hell.
Everything was fine this time.
They dragged her out of paradise after not a particularly long lifetime, sure, but a lifetime of constant violence and struggle and emotional suffering. She finally has peace.
Yeah, I was gonna say those things will make somebody like really covet peace and stability, especially because like heaven's not just peace and stability, it is the ultimate peace, stability, and eternal happiness in the classical sense at least.
And the people she loves, who she went through all that for, who she died for in the first place, drag her out of that back to the violence, back to the struggle and the suffering. And that is difficult for her, and when they find out, difficult for them to deal with. It's this whole thing. And the more I think about it as I've become a writer more myself, as I've delved into like breaking down media myself, the more I think that is fucking brilliant. That's how you do a resurrection right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good one. I like that a lot, especially because it works really well as a surprise because like you said, the first time she died, she explicitly fought her way back from hell. Of
Yeah.
course, her coming back to life was a good thing.
No.
Which is the perfect example for the second time to be like, no, it was heaven this time. It was great.
Yeah.
Everything was fine.
And that's the thing, like you it's things like that. It's things like the Red Hood that show you can do a resurrection or a near-death experience as like a lesser version, not lesser in like quality, but lesser in scale of the same issue. If you still make it have consequence and significance because it should still be a big deal. That's why one of the biggest gripes I have with TTRPGs, especially like as much as I love it, especially like D&D, is that after you get past like a certain level, a fairly low level, access to resurrection magic is plentiful and easy to come by. In 5e, the only thing restricting you after fifth level from casting a revival spell is having access to an expensive enough diamond and having a minute after combat ends to do it. So the lenience of a GM, I guess, or your willingness to go looking for a diamond, you know?
What if you just make up an excuse to make everybody talk for like exactly 61 seconds about whether they want to resurrect the person or not before they do it?
And the higher the level you get, right, the easier it is to the more time can be spent apart up to like hundreds of years when you get to really high levels, and the easier it gets to just get access to diamonds. There are ways you could just make one. And that makes the stakes of those characters dying suddenly feel a lot less important.
Yeah, it's really crazy when a lot of people on the lower scale have to suffer and die just because the people with the real power who could do whatever they want don't care. Wait, sorry, we're done with politics.
Yeah, although it does, that also is an interesting like rabbit hole to get into if you really want to. Of like, there's probably some capitalist asshole like level 20 cleric who worships the god of commerce or something, charging like hundreds upon hundreds of dollars for reviving lost loved ones or ancestors you want to talk to, or
Oh yeah, I'm really good at it. I did it 12 times last week. But that's because there were 12 people who could afford it last week. How about
yeah.
you?
You end up with whole worlds with weird questions like that, and worlds where death just doesn't mean anything to the people it should matter to, both in and out of universe. Comic books are the same deal, where characters are constantly dying and coming back and dying and coming back and dying and coming back. You know, it's why, even as a child, watching watching Dragon Ball, in particular the sequels, going, why is like, oh, we blew up again. Oh no, I bet this was permanent this time. Haha. Oh, he's back.
Yeah, there were only a couple times it felt really, really serious. So one of them being like Boo's rampage in Dragon Ball, where it's like, oh, Boo just murdered everybody on the planet all at once, and a bunch of those people he didn't just kill, he ate. Like, what do we do? We can't bring everyone back if everyone is dead.
It is crazy, like when you take a step back and you go, half the plot of like DBZ onwards is finding progressively more contrived ways to make all the death feel relevant and then immediately undoing all that effort. And comic books
Meanwhile,
are the same.
Meanwhile, despite all the chances back everybody else got, they erased the entire universe Future Trunks came from, and there wasn't even a single mention of possibly bringing it back or undoing it or giving the boy a chance to actually have his happy ending. His happy ending is that him and his girlfriend didn't get erased. The entire rest of his universe is still gone. Everything he fought for, everything he suffered for, everything he went through going back and forth between two different timelines just to try to make the one he came from better, gone. Didn't matter. Nobody cares anymore.
It is also genuinely funny to me that it is one of those weird instances where there is this story going on, and then there's a much more compelling story just happening off to the side somewhere off screen.
That's why I've always loved Future Trunks so much, and it like I felt slapped in the face by what they ended up doing when they brought him back in Super. I was like, you got to be kidding me. This You can't treat my boy like this. He was the cool icon so many young boys wished they could be when I was a kid, just from how he showed up and wrecked Frieza while also being the only character with a sword for some reason.
That he never uses again. Yeah. Um,
And listen, it's just a sword. It's a lot less tough than he is.
but comic books are the same, and superhero media in general are kind of in the same boat where Superman dies in a comic and he's back in a couple volumes later, or it's like, oh, they brought back someone with the Lazarus Pit again. Fucking hate the Lazarus Pit.
I know it's really weird that it's gotten used as much as it did too, because like It's one of the other things they touch on in Under the Red Hood. The Lazarus is not a perfect uh resurrection. Ra's al Ghul isn't just a messed up, slightly crazy dick because he always has been. He gets a little crazier every time he comes back from the dead. The Lazarus doesn't fully restore you. You're not 100% you anymore when you come out of it. It's not just the trauma of not coming back to life. It keeps something of you when it brings you back. Or at least it's supposed to. Sometimes the story doesn't treat it like it does.
Yeah, which is a big part of the problem. And Marvel has its problems as well. It's not much better. Look no further than the Infinity Saga, Infinity War, into Endgame are the high points of the MCU. They are two of the best movies in the franchise. They're two incredibly dramatic high points. The end of Infinity War, half of all life goes away. And yet, in Endgame, you do feel the consequences of that. It does feel like it matters. And then, to the best of my knowledge, now I have dropped off, so I could be wrong, I admit, but from what I can see from the outside looking in, other than Spider-Man missing Tony Stark, it seems like after everyone's back, they just kind of go back to normal like it never happened.
Yeah, and it feels really weird. That's something that should color everything else that happens in that world for the rest of all time.
There is a 4-year gap in the life experiences of people. People who have twins are now 4 years older than their twin.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really crazy in that context.
So you get all these weird ways death could be like this really significant thing could be mishandled in a story. Either you get characters who have not nearly a strong enough reaction to a death that should matter to them, or you get worlds where death just doesn't seem to matter at all to an audience. And then in those worlds, you get really weird things happen, like characters reacting incredibly strongly to a death like they should if they lived in a world where death mattered. But then someone waves their hands immediately and it's fixed, and that can just keep happening. But people still keep reacting the same way, even though there's death with no consequence, because it just doesn't seem to matter to anyone.
Yeah, death is not something where anything should happen, even if somebody is resurrected from the dead, that just makes somebody a couple seconds later go, "Oh, okay, I guess it's fine."
People should not die and then be joking about the fact they straight up died a month later. Like, that is something that should take a lot of time to process, even if you are going to resurrect them.
Or at least if the person is going to make jokes about that, work that into the trauma or how they feel, or make it a part of everybody else's trauma where everybody who didn't die is like, how can you joke about this? What's wrong with you? Do you know how upset we all were?
Yeah, I mean, say what you want about Game of Thrones' final seasons, but they resurrected Jon Snow, spoilers, I know, and that man was fucked up about it for the rest of the show.
Yeah, and I really hope if he gets resurrected in the books too, that he is, and that's a major element. Like, just oh, just treat Jamie better. Oh my God, Jamie. I can't believe such a great turnaround for a character got so horribly thrown in the trash and undone just before killing him.
Yeah, speaking of deaths, that just felt like, what? Why?
Why?
But we've talked a lot about the mechanics of writing death and how death should feel in universe. It does raise some questions though, right? If it's such a big deal, if it's so if it's such a landmine to do it right, and is such a big deal to the readers, to your audience, where it's such a significant part of human life that you wouldn't want to fuck it up, or you're going, if you do it right, even, you're going to cause pain, probably. Why do it?
And, it's because it's unavoidable. Since death is a constant, eternal, inevitable thing in real life, the absence of it is felt just as much as its presence. You
Yeah,
can't avoid that.
having a story where the stakes should clearly be life or death, and just not have death be presented as an option feels weird, right?
Yeah, the only way to like justify death not having a presence in a story is for it to have never had dangerous stakes that could be adjacent to death in the first place. Like, obviously nobody's going, man, how come none of the neighbors ever died in Hello Kitty? But like, you know, you look at a story like Dragon Ball, like, man, people are fighting and killing and dying all the time, and everybody just comes back to life. And then the one or two times they were like, no, this person can't come back to life later, they were like, well, now they can.
Yeah, it is why, it is that sort of weird disconnect. Like obviously shows aimed at really young kids, they get very careful about if they're gonna kill someone off, how they do it, things like that. You'll see someone get shot in the head and walk it off, and you'll be like, no, that person is dead. And
No, it's okay. They were rubber bullets. It's fine.
yeah, and like the older, well, that could still kill you.
No, it's
It's
okay.
just less
It's
likely to.
he's a protagonist, so he has a really thick, hard skull, and
Yeah.
he's fine. It's rubber bullets.
It's like they're supposed to just be an ordinary person, but they get just experience something that should clearly have killed them, and they just don't because the writers are like, we can't do this, we can't make the 6-year-olds cry. And it's like fair, you probably can't, but you do have that reaction when you just the minute you get out of the age bracket where you're not questioning why these ordinary people are taking lethal damage and not even bleeding, and you sort of go, this is creating a bit of a disconnect. And you can definitely still get that problem in adult media too.
Oh yeah, especially because kids kids just get sad. Sometimes they don't understand, but they still internalize when a character dies for the most part. Some adults handle it way worse than a kid because they're going to get mad and direct their rage at the actual author or at other people involved. Be like, why did this have to happen? And so everyone else can be like, it's, I don't know, man, it's a story.
It's just one of those things where, look, I don't agree with the advice of killing a character just to make drama.
Nope, because there's always other ways you can do it. You don't have to do that.
I don't necessarily agree with, I definitely don't agree with the school of thought of, oh, you're stuck, kill someone off to, make the story move. I mean, you don't kill a character off unless you want to, unless you feel like it benefits the story, because unlike real life where death is effectively random and meaningless, except to the people affected, in a story, it should have meaning
Because it's
beyond
always a
that.
choice.
Notice I'm not saying significance because there's always significance in reality and in fiction. It's meaning that's a bit different because in real life, people just die. It's a product of aging. In fiction, if you kill off a character, you are taking something away from your audience voluntarily. You are making the choice to do that, to take a pathways that your story could follow away from them. So what you're left with has to make that sacrifice that you are foisting upon your audience worth it.
You know, it's a great example of that. Spoilers for anybody who hasn't watched Gurren Lagann. If you're curious, just ignore me for like 20 or 30 seconds. But man, Kamina, literally nobody reading the story, watching the story, or in the story was ready for his death right then and there. And they they never stop letting you feel it from the horrible, horrible pit of depression Simone falls into to the fact that every single person is like mourning him or being inspired by him or being affected him in his own way because despite the fact that Simone is obviously our main point of view character from the beginning of the story, Kamina was the hero, Kamina was the leader, Kamina was the inspiration, the one who had the most relationships, the one who interacted with and was a part of everybody's life. And then suddenly, all at once, with no warning, even in a moment where it seems like ultimately everything's going to be okay, early on, I think like episode 7, if you're watching the show, he's taken away from us. It's just gone with no ambiguity that he might come back, nothing.
Yeah, so much of the show after that is actually just about filling the void he left.
Yeah, and even all the way up to the end, like we're still getting moments of him being inspirational and how important he was to everybody involved, especially Simone in the moment that he becomes more like them and in a sense finally surpasses him, the main city they built has a statue to him, and that happened so many years after he was gone.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like we talk about what remains, what you give your audience has to make it worth it. And there are definitely so many things that do make making that decision worth it because of how important death is to people, to the human experience, you know? You can write entire stories about processing death that can resonate at such a deep level with an audience. You can explore some of the most basic, primal, deep human feelings, human emotions in a story about loss and grief. You can explore consequences of that loss, and that can make for a very compelling narrative because the loss of a life, especially the loss of a lot of life, has consequences. That is hundreds of people grieving. That is economies falling apart. That is a tragedy that should be remembered in history.
It's a change in the direction of the flow of the world and life itself for a whole chunk of it.
Exactly. And that's why death is such a powerful tool in the hands of an author. It is why killing characters isn't just something that should be cheap shock value. It's something that should resonate and mean something to people in universe and to the audience, just because that is what death is in reality. At least to anyone with, any shred of empathy and or fear. It should make characters and audience feel something, and it is a very, very strong tool to achieve the goal of making your audience feel something, to think about things, which ultimately is what most good stories are aiming to do.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it feels like it's, much like how I described death itself simpler, handling it is both very complex, but in some ways deceptively simple. And that, like, the most important part of handling death, I see, like, narratively, is just respect. No matter what direction you want to take it, no matter what you're going to do with it, you cannot represent and affect death well into your story if you don't have enough respect for what it is and where it is as a place in life and how much it means objectively, regardless of how much it means to you.
Well said. It is something that's such an important part of the human experience that is so deeply tied to so many primal emotions that it has to be handled with respect, arguably with a degree of dignity, although not necessarily in universe, but as a writer for the feelings that accompany death, for that sort of grief. And it
Yeah.
is strange how many stories, how many expanded universes of stories, franchises, whatever, don't do that. It is the universal experience. It's something that everyone should be able to relate to and understand. So it baffles me that so many stories fumble the ball when it comes to how they handle death, all the way down to some of the most iconic stories ever written. Hell,
Yeah.
like what do you think about it? Like the oldest written story known to man, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is about a guy who is terrified of dying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the most ancient things. I mean, living things that aren't even complex enough to process emotions and think, such as we think of thinking, still have a concept of and avoid death. It is all encompassing, but like any aspect of life, you have to continue to think of it. It's not all encompassing in a way that is stifling and swallows everything else up. Death is an end, but it's never the end. Whether you believe in afterlife or whatever or not, even if nothing that dies continues, or what about everything that doesn't? It's so weighty, it's so heavy. It affects everything, everyone, even all the people who never think about death and don't fully have a concept of what it is are being partially shaped by it every day.
It's the one thing. I mean, probably not the one thing, but the one thing I can think of right now, certainly, that as a writer, you can't screw up how you use it. And I don't mean that as in it's impossible to do wrong, because clearly it's very possible to do wrong. What I mean is you shouldn't do it wrong. Not just because the kind of effect it should be having on people should be self-evident to you as a mortal being, but because the impact of doing it wrong is not one you want to leave on your audience.
No, handling death poorly always feels even worse than never having handled it to begin with.
Exactly. Speaking of death, though, I have seen the time, and I know that we're on a bit of a time crunch today, fittingly enough, thematically for this episode. So we should probably kill this episode and move on.
This episode has to end as all things do, and we're gonna be affected by that, but we have to continue.
So if you are listening to this and maybe aren't quite ready to say goodbye and want to go back and listen again, or would like to listen to the episodes that have come before or that will come after, you can, if you are listening to these episodes on Spotify or YouTube or Podbean or whatever, you can also find them on my website, radfordwrites.com, where I also share my various stories and poems, where you can buy my books, where you can read blogs and articles, all of that good stuff, where you can catch my other podcast, Fixation, plenty of other collaborations with John there as well, of course, and you can find John's content on Twitch and YouTube under Sephir, Sephear, where he streams things.
I do those things, and one day I'm gonna die, but I haven't yet.
Anyway, bye.